don't know about you, but personally, I only play my porn games for the story and lore. Particularly this one, Kichikuou Rance. I would go even further and say that Kichikuou Rance is one of the best video games ever made. And it honestly blows a lot of Western RPGs out of the water when it comes to player agency, reactivity, and, well, not choice and consequence. Something much better, actually. Kichikuou Rance, initially planned as Rance 5, the 7th game in the Rance series, of course, because you also had Rance 4.1 and 4.2, was initially, well, just planned as Rance 5, but it kind of turned into the final game of the series. Sort of. As you can tell, there's quite a bit of lore going on, and a lot of this lore was only introduced in Rance 3 and Rance 4, and while there were a bunch of hints for a larger plotline in it, it didn't really get resolved in those games. It turns out the devs had a whole lot of stuff planned for the series, and they weren't sure if they would ever get to finish it. So they decided, why not, just in case, cram everything that we have planned for the series into one game. Let me tell you that after Kichikuou Rance, the series got rebooted, and we got Rance 5D, Rance 6, Sengoku Rance, Rance Quest, Rance 9, and Rance 10. Rance 10 also happens to be, at least by some metrics, the longest video game script in history. Now, all of that stuff was essentially crammed into this game. I mean, of course, it was fleshed out a lot more, and there were a lot of additions and some retcons in the canonical continuation, but still, the basic plot outline of 6 games in one game. I think it's safe to say that Kichikuou Rance is one of the most epic games ever made, and that alone makes it worth talking about. Just to be clear though, yes, this is a porn game, or rather, a game with porn in it. The protagonist also happens to be a rapist, and there's a bunch of dark things happening in this game. So, if you can't handle any of that, you were warned. I should also add that this game is best experienced blind, so if at any point you become interested in this game, you think it'd be cool to play, go out and play it. The game was made freeware by Alicesoft, and there is an English translation patch floating around. Pretty sure you should be able to find an English working version of this game just via Google. However, I would highly recommend running it via the X-System 35 SDL2 port of the engine, which actually also lets you play this game on iOS and Android. There's one or two little bugs with music playback here and there, and the font is a little different, but at least for me it runs much better than trying to run the original Windows version. I'll have a link in the description. I will try to avoid any major spoilers in this video, but there'll be some spoilers. Also, I will not be showing anything explicitly not safe for work, because of course I'm not. But again, there's a whole lot of dark and rather mature subject matters in this video. I wouldn't call it safe for work either. With that said, let's dive into it. Going over the previous games in the series would be a little too much. It definitely helps having played them, or at least having a basic understanding of the characters when you play this game, but it's not necessary. Will you get the best experience? No. I'll mention some things when they become relevant. Suffice to say, at the beginning of this game, Rance, our titular anti-hero, finds himself as the leader of a bandit group, which is exactly the kind of thing you'd expect the self-proclaimed hero of justice to do, isn't it? Rance is pretty much a caricature of your average JRPG protagonist. The series really started as a parody series of contemporary JRPG and fantasy tropes, and well, it turned into something much larger, especially in the scope of this game. Rance is essentially very selfish, very horny, and very hard to think of as heroic, to borrow some words from the Rance 6 intro here. Just hanging around, chilling, robbing the occasional merchant is not really enough for Rance after a while. He has larger aspirations. Really, his life goal is to, of course, fuck every beautiful woman on the continent. As a result, he ends up attacking the nearby cities, and then proceeds to get his shit kicked in by the army. his band of bandits gets destroyed, Syl, his slave and sidekick, gets captured, and he just barely manages to get away with his life. In case you're wondering, no, this isn't me having fun in Sony Vegas, this is the actual opening of the game. Something it already showcases quite impressively is the huge cast of characters this game will throw at you. Mind you, most of these are new characters in the series. There's quite a bunch of recurring faces like these two here, but a whole lot of these are new or have barely appeared before, at best maybe mentioned. To top it all off, this intro doesn't even show all the characters, there's plenty more. I have no idea why they repeat some of the characters in some of these scenes here, because yeah, they still had plenty more to pick from, really. Still quite a banger for a 1996 game. Rance, after all this, barely manages to drag himself over to the border of the Azas. He happens to have some acquaintances in there, and one of them happens to be the Queen, who, believe it or not, actually is in love with him and really wants to marry him. Rance is deathly afraid of something like commitment, but it is a good chance to get control of an army and take revenge against Hellman, and also while he's at it, free his slave Syl. So, somewhat reluctantly, he actually agrees, and marries Leah. Now, becoming the king of Liazos will probably bring him one step closer to his life goal as well. However, his inauguration speech doesn't go too well, and he immediately plunges the country into civil war. So yeah, if it's not clear by now, Rance isn't exactly a good guy, and he's not supposed to be. To be fair, I also don't think he's exactly evil. He's actually somewhat complicated, but he does make for a really good protagonist, because you can be sure that as long as he's around, the plot is not going to stand still. Something that this scene also showcases pretty well, in my opinion, is one of the key aspects of the writing in the series. It manages to stay somewhat grounded, because most of the characters around him and most of the plot around him, while there's still quite a few parody and caricature elements, is actually relatively grounded and serious. It is a little more like Rance is the anomaly inserted into a proper fantasy world, and not the other way around, having a fantasy world that's entirely built around the idea of Rance being a dickhead. Though there are still quite a few surprises and peculiarities about the setting, which we will probably not get into too much here, but you can glean a lot of it just from the dialogue in the background. The series overall has a very ambivalent tone. It'll go from very funny, very absurdist, very wacky humor, to gut-wrenching stuff in the span of a minute. So now that we are officially king of the country, we get to do stuff. Actually, there is a little bit of a prologue with the bandit face that I mostly skipped here. You already get to do some basic combat there, but here is where the game starts. Kind of. This is still a little bit of a tutorial segment, but it is not a forced step-by-step tutorial. And aside from some overall limitations, we actually get access to every action that we get to perform throughout the entire game. Really, the only limitation is that on the very first turn, we do not get to initiate combat. and we do not get to initiate combat against any territory that is not owned by rebels. Which is also justified in the story, as Maris will stop you and tell you that maybe we should sort out this whole civil war thing first before we attack other countries. That might be a very stupid idea. And while Rance isn't the smartest of people, he does listen to reason sometimes. At a glance, this game might appear like a strategy game, and it sort of is, superficially anyways. You have a world map with territories on it, and the end goal of the game is to conquer all the territories. But make no mistake, this is not a grand strategy game. At least, I wouldn't call it that. There really isn't too much to the mechanics as far as the strategic depth goes. There's no economy management, there's no diplomacy, there's no logistics to speak of. Well, technically there's economy management. You have one resource, it's money. Depending on how many territories you own, you get more per turn. There's actually different income levels for every territory, so there's a tiny bit of strategizing if you want to maximize profits early on. You can theoretically prioritize economically valuable territories over other ones, but really, the main considerations you have to do in this game are very different, and we'll get to that. But first, let's actually go over the basic actions that you get to perform. For one, you have a build action. You can construct a building of a preset list, and you then have to wait until the building is finished, until you can build another one. These buildings are unique. You cannot build multiple of them, and really they usually don't provide any kind of inherent bonus or anything. It's just that each building unlocks a new town action you can perform, which is the next type of action. Whenever you click on any territory you own, then you get a couple of actions to perform. The two basic actions that you can perform on pretty much every territory are Bolster Defense, which will give defending units in a battle there a defensive bonus, and a Temporary Levy, which really is just a euphemism for Rance pillaging the village. Doing so will add funds to your treasury, and can also sometimes give you special items and cause other things. The next type of action is a Talk action. You can select one of your subordinates from the subordinate menu and talk to them. What that does depends highly on who you talk to and when you do it and what other things you've done. The other thing you can do from the subordinate menu is a troop action. There's two types. You can either increase the maximum amount of a commander's troops, or you can replenish their troops to full. Both of these will cost money, but the former is much more expensive, though the cost also depends entirely on the type of unit that is assigned to the commander, which you cannot change. The next type of action is an attack. You can attack a territory as many times as you want, or as many different territories as many times as you want, as long as you don't take anything. The moment you take a territory, you cannot perform any further attacks on the turn. It doesn't matter how you get a territory, by the way, as long as you get a territory, you do not get to attack. Around the map, aside from the normal territories which are marked by flags, you can see that there are roads going to other places. They're not really marked in any way, shape or form, but if you click on them, you can explore them. You do this by selecting one of your subordinates, who will then have to descend a dungeon, fight random monsters, and well, certain dungeons and certain floors will also have special encounters or special items you can gain. There's reasons to go to these dungeons. Some of them are a little special and don't even have any combat in them. You know, you just have to learn that as you go, but the point is you can do this once per turn. And then, last but not least, of course, there's the harem action. Once per turn you get to call a woman from your harem to Rance, and what happens then I'll leave up to your imagination, though I'm pretty certain you will not be able to correctly guess all the things that can result from a harem action. Trust me, do not ignore this option. There's also a merchant that you can buy items from. You can do this as many times as you want per turn, but I don't know, most of the items he sells aren't that good. You can perform exactly one action of each of these types per turn, and then really the only thing that's left to do is end the turn. You can also perform these actions in any order you want, so you can first attack a place and then stock up some troops. However, each commander that is used for an action does not get to go again, and you can also not perform any other actions on them, meaning a commander that was used to attack a territory cannot be talked to or can have his troops replenished, which means that normally you want to replenish the troops before attacking. Also important, once you end your turn, the enemy phase begins, and if an enemy attacks you, you get a choice whether to defend the territory or not. If you choose to defend, only commanders that have not taken an action in your phase will be able to deploy, so you have to make sure you always keep some in reserve. Speaking of combat, let's go over that quickly too. To play the game and play it well, you don't actually need to understand all the details. There are generally two types of units. There's front and backline units. Frontline units can only attack other frontline units, that is, the 2 top units in the list, and backline units can attack anybody they want. But of course, usually backline units are pretty damn weak. There are also some units that are actually both front and backline units. Be aware that if you want a backline unit to attack a frontline unit with their frontline attack, you have to actually switch their attack mode. A unit can also defend, which, well, increases their defense when they get attacked next, and a unit can also wait. The wait command is used to charge up for special attacks. Not every unit has a special attack, so this is wasted on most of them. And honestly, most of the special attacks aren't that good either. Some of them are really useful though. For example, Rance's Rance attack can be used to directly hit a commander's HP. This is where we get to the one peculiarity of the combat system which throws a lot of people off when they first play the game. You need to understand that a unit consists of a commander and their soldiers. Also, each territory has a battle size. City fights will always have a much smaller battle size than the plain fights. The problem is that in order for a commander to participate in an attack, the amount of troops he has must be below the battle size. So, for example, if we have a commander with 1,000 troops, but we are fighting in a city which only has a size of 200, every time this commander will attack or defend, 200 of his soldiers will join the attack. Thus, only up to 200 of them can also die. However, once his troops get whittled down to 200 or less, he himself will also join the attacks. Only from here on out can he either take damage or deal damage. This is important because each commander has separate stats from his troops, so don't be confused why your unit isn't doing any better just because you equip the commander with an item that increases his attack. It's not going to do anything unless he actually joins the attack. There will also be enemies later in the game that can only be defeated by commanders that have certain items equipped. If you fight them in a battle with too many soldiers and too small a battle size, you will never be able to kill them because your commander with the equipped item never actually gets to attack them. This is why sometimes you don't actually want to replenish your commander's troops, but instead keep their units relatively small so that they can directly intervene in the battles. However, doing so comes at a risk. The only way of actually defeating a unit is to kill the commander. As long as the commander doesn't join the attacks, he also can't be killed. This is why sometimes special attacks like Rance's Rance attack are useful, because they can be used to directly drain an enemy commander's HP without putting your own commander at risk. Also worth noting is that the game actually has an auto attack and auto defend feature, which has to be enabled and disabled for each unit individually, and a fast forward/skip feature by holding the right mouse button. If you think that's pretty advanced for a 1996 game, Rance 3 came out in 1991 and had the same. So this is some real cutting edge smut here. By now you might have noticed that almost everything in the game seems to cause a whole lot of text to pop up. If you don't like visual novels, you're not gonna like this game. Pretty much everything you do will cause some kind of story event to occur. And this really is where the main focus of the game lies. It's much more about figuring out what consequences your actions will have. As you make your way through this sort of tutorial section, you'll get introduced to a whole lot of this concept. Defeating commanders in battle will sometimes kill them, but sometimes it will also knock them out, and then you will generally get some kind of event related to recruiting them. You'll also be introduced to the concept of, well, making choices. For example, Malphas right here will get an event where we get to make a choice. We can either have sex with her, or not. And it turns out, this is a porn game after all. Not having sex is the wrong option. Other commanders, once you defeat them in battle, will just run away. X, the leader of the rebellion, is one of those kind of characters, and these will usually require some kind of specific actions to be taken to deal with. In this case, this is taking over the headquarters of the rebellion. After this, you'll get an event where you get to choose how to deal with X. And depending on what option you choose here, you will also learn that these options only proclaim intent, but not necessarily outcome. You can choose to let X join you, but he will decline, and instead just be banished. After you've dealt with the rebellion, you're now free to attack any other territory on the map that is adjacent to your territories. The most natural next step is to turn your attention to the free cities to the south of Liazas, as there are simply a collection of independent cities. They're not gonna gang up on you. An interesting thing about the free cities is that for each one you get to choose whether to take them by force or negotiate. The negotiation option works a little different for every city. Some will refuse to negotiate and have to be taken by force, others will demand some kind of payment, and some might have even more special conditions attached to them. For example, Rock Earth here is run by the rather shady DX Association, who offer you to hand over the city for free and even pay you some money on top, as long as you let them keep doing their shady business. Of course, this will have consequences. At some point you're going to see a start of turn event where they will abduct an innocent little schoolgirl and do things to her. You can of course prevent this by either not accepting the idea in the first place, crushing the DX Association via a town option before this event happens, or by preempting them and doing a temporary levy in the town of South, which will result in an event where you get to have that girl join Rance's harem on her own. If you get her into your harem and you call her a bunch, you will get to see her story. She's really just a schoolgirl, afraid of bad grades and of what her parents will do to her, who much rather escapes her old schoolgirl life, and is actually pretty content living in Rance's harem. Being put in Rance's harem and being called a bunch of times so you trigger all these events unfolding is actually considered her fortune ending, and we'll talk more about those later. Putting it all like this might make this seem like a rather simple example and might make the correct path to take here rather obvious. However, as you play the game, things aren't really that simple. For one, you have no idea what exactly the outcome of these actions will be. You'll also have no idea that doing a temporary levy at South is going to get the girl into your harem and save her from the DX Association. Keep in mind that all the other actions you take in a turn might also have their own consequences, leading to larger chains of events, which you will be occupied with following. I've also mentioned start of turn events. Well, there are a lot of those too. Some of them will be caused by things you did in the past, and some of them are just things that happen at set times. There's a time limit to the entire game, sort of, or at least a timeline of events. Some things will happen no matter what you do. Remember all that lore at the very start of the video? Yeah, there's a good reason all of that was there, and it all catches up to you rather quickly. Not too long after defeating the rebellion, the demons will make their appearance. Turns out that the current Demon King is rather unwilling to actually be the Demon King, which might be because she's not even from this world. This is actually a native isekai story, if you will. And she escapes, is now running away with her old boyfriend from our world, and, well, just really wants to go home. There's two factions in the demon world. One, the Cabeless faction, who just wants to kill Miki and make Cabeless the new demon lord. On the other hand, we have the daughter of the previous Demon King, Hornet, who just wants to see her father's last wish fulfilled, and therefore wants to keep Miki alive and convince her to become the Demon King. And as it happens, Miki just ends up at Liaz's castle at some point, followed by some of Cabeless's followers, who are issuing an ultimatum to Rance to hand over Miki, and, well, of course he's not gonna do that because Miki and one of her companions are beautiful women. Of course they belong to him. He's not gonna hand them over. This means that from now on, the task force sent by Cabeless to retrieve Miki is going to attack us in the enemy phase. This complicates matters a little bit because, well, you need to have more commanders in reserve to defend against their attacks, which luckily isn't too hard, but it can get really annoying. So why not kill them? Because there's only two weapons in the entire world that can actually harm fiends, aside from other fiends. They're Nico the Lightblade and Chaos the Darksword. The former happens to be a companion of Miki. Yes, she's also a woman that has to have sex with Rance to then turn into a sword so that Rance can use her. It's a porn game, right? And Chaos is actually a recurring character from previous games in the series. Rance has used him in battle before. However, a rather pious nun took it upon herself to remove this rather dangerous implement from Rance and keep it safe. It's a rather understandable position, honestly. In order to even have a chance of getting it back, you first have to conquer the city Red, which is where Cell lives. And when you engage with her via a town action, she just refuses to give it back. It doesn't matter what you do. She asks Rance some questions to figure out whether he's maybe actually become virtuous in the meantime, which is her one condition to hand Chaos over, if Rance actually turns out to be the hero of justice he proclaims to be. And no matter what you answer here, she will not hand it over. Even if you fuck her, she will not hand it over. Which is kind of a shocker, right? Are there actually some things that sex doesn't solve in this game? I won't spoil the entirety of the solution to this here, but just to give you an outlook on how this game is really just an adventure game in disguise, getting Chaos involves defeating another demon to make another demon show up, who will then, if you've done some of the correct things before, actually get the sword from Cell, and then if you deploy Rance in battle against him when he has Chaos, and attack him with Rance specifically, and he has to be in the attack. Remember the whole battle size thing before? Yeah. If he actually personally attacks that fiend, he will steal Chaos back from him. This is where we really get into the idea that Kichikuou Rance largely functions on a principle of action and consequence versus choice and consequence. Because most of the things that you do will have consequences. And it actually means the things you do. Not just the choices you make in like the predefined choice segments, but actually the basic verbs that you as the player use to interact with the game. Most of the consequences are results from these. The main difference between this and the more traditional choice and consequence is that it doesn't feel like you're just choosing between preset paths that are already written out for you, but you're actually much more in charge of creating your own path. And man, it's really hard to get this across correctly by talking about series of events, because that's how your normal setup in a quest in your traditional RPG goes anyways. You do A, then B, then C, bam, there's the solution. But you have to keep in mind that as you play in the game, especially for the first time, you don't actually know the end state yet. There are no quests in this game. There are no explicit goals beyond some vague ideas of, well, I guess I gotta try to get Chaos, huh? And a lot of the things that will happen in this game aren't really intended to happen because you specifically set out to trigger them, but just because you did things that happened to make them happen. It's much more about the journey rather than the destination. Before we go on, let's get a little bit abstract. Your average RPG looks something like this. You have a linear main quest, and branching off the side are side quests. The fact they're perpendicular is supposed to imply that they are mechanically completely separate from the main story progression. You can do them whenever you want, you can do them in any order, doesn't really matter. They're not actually tied to the main quest progression. Sometimes the main quest might have a couple of branches in it, but really the main idea usually is this. One main quest, and then a bunch of side quests that are largely disconnected from the main quest. Kichikuou Rance, on the other hand, looks something like this. Don't worry, this might look a little bit confusing at first, but that's very much by design. It's not actually a very accurate representation. Kichikuou Rance doesn't actually have quests, so it's kind of hard to come up with something to visualize this. Really, it's just a big collection of flags and triggers that the player can set and, well, trigger. And then there's events that can result from that. And this is all very much by design. In a big interview Series director Tada gave after his retirement, he said that he was the only person in charge of these flags, triggers, and events, and he didn't do any kind of note-taking, any kind of diagrams, any kind of anything outside of just having them in his brain. You know, the tools you use always shape the product you get. And I think this is a great example of this. Kichikuou Rance is not the kind of game that could have been created by someone making spreadsheets or flowcharts of quest triggers. The result is far more beautiful, and actually has something that might be considered emergent story progression. Granted, there are main story events which are absolutely compulsory and you will have to see throughout the entire game. And the actual main story, so to speak, doesn't have that many different outcomes. Well, there's arguably 14 different endings in the game, but I'm not gonna go into this. The progression of the main plot isn't gonna change too much, sort of. Everything that's not a main story event is technically optional, but you will have to see a lot of them. You will have to get commanders to actually beat the game. You will see some of their events. But which one of them you see, and which order you see them, how you get to see them, all of that is different and depends entirely on the actions you take. And by that I mean the actual basic actions you take. Which territories you conquer, when you conquer them, which commanders you use to conquer them, which items you equip, which items you don't equip, which dungeons you visit, which commanders you deploy together in battle, which commander you use to attack certain other commanders. All of these things, just the absolute basic things you do, will have consequences in these story events. On a first playthrough, it is usually very hard to distinguish what events are compulsory and part of the main plot and which ones just happen because you did something. And that's a good thing. Everything you do feels like one consistent whole. Everything is connected. And not like in that Fallout New Vegas video, it raises some good points about why Fallout New Vegas is actually better than Fallout 3, but it is purely limited to world building. In Kichikuou Rance, everything is connected mechanically. Everything you do on your way through the, so to speak, main quest is going to have side effects. And these side effects in turn will influence your path through the main quest. And so far, pretty much every playthrough I had, didn't matter how much I knew about a lot of these triggers, a lot of these events, which ones are good for me, which ones are not. Every single time I try to set out to do a certain thing a certain way, it never ends up happening that way because there's some other stuff I forget about or that I just didn't know about. There really is a lot going on in this game, and while it is possible to theory craft the perfect routes, and people have done so, it took a lot of effort. This game is really good at obfuscating all of its inner workings, and it's all in service of creating a game that feels very unique and driven by your own actions. An interesting side effect of this is that to the completionist mindset, this game is probably unbearable. The game is inherently un-100%able. And unless you want to count across many different runs, and the game doesn't really officially track this. The only thing it tracks are the different fortunes and misfortunes you've achieved for characters. But beyond that, it doesn't really care, and neither should you. You're gonna go insane. I mean, this is the kind of game where it is literally impossible to recruit every commander in one run. There's more commanders than commander slots. Some commanders are so exclusive to each other that they didn't even bother giving each commander their own slot. There's commanders that are literally in the same slot in the roster because you can only get one of them, no matter what you do. And if your idea of a good run through a game is being able to make everybody happy, you're in for a disappointment. I've mentioned instances of Rance fucking someone solving problems, so how about the opposite? Midran, a rather timid, introverted, somewhat socially awkward young woman. She's still beating herself up about some of the things she did in Rance 2, and she feels very responsible for those around her. She's recruited by conquering the city of Custom, where she and some other old companions of Rance live, and she will also, along with them, join Rance's army and his harem. Calling her in the harem will result in, well, a sex scene, and after that, at the start of every turn, there's a chance she just kills herself. The only way to stop her from killing herself is to have sex with her twice and then talk to her. This will also reveal that Rance is in fact maybe not evil. He might be dumb and selfish, but he doesn't necessarily intend to be an asshole to everybody around him. He actually promises Ran to not have sex with her, and she will be removed from the harem. The even better way of preventing all of this, of course, is to just never have sex with her, which is also her fortune ending. At the end of the game, that is, whenever you get a game over or an ending to the game will actually tell you about all the fortunes and misfortunes that you've caused. These are limited to female characters for some reason, though it's not like your actions can't have consequences for male characters, they're just not tracked explicitly. So the only way to get Ran's fortune ending, the official good outcome for her, is to never have Ran sex with her. And you'd be surprised by how many characters like this there are. Some of them even require a complete lack of interaction with Rance. If you even just recruit them into your harem, they can already not get their good ending. Doesn't mean they get their misfortune necessarily, some of them will, but at least they won't get their fortune ending. This doesn't mean that all you have to do to get all the good endings for the characters is to be, your typical goody two-shoes and just never do anything that would seem like the obvious bad thing. Because some of the fortune endings also apply to female characters you might find despicable yourself. Things are not that easy in this game. It's really just all a mess of conflicting interests, and everybody trying to carve out some luck for themselves. There are also plenty of instances of mutually exclusive fortunes, so you can literally not make everybody happy in one playthrough. For example, Leah and Syl are both competing for Rance's love. Only one of them can get it. There's no way to make both of them happy. In fact, if you have sex with Syl more than with Leah, then Leah will get jealous and turn Syl into a cow. She will then also be removed from the harem and your roster. For reasons I'm not going to get into here, there's a point in the game where if you don't have Syl available, Kichikuou will die. You don't know who that is, but she will die. However, this will also open up recruiting some other characters. It will also prevent another character from dying. So, things are complicated. It is annoying though to lose another backline unit. There isn't that many of them. And while Syl isn't very strong in the beginning, she can get pretty good. Still though, backline units, for some reason, seem to be extremely endangered in this game. Kichikuou is a backline unit too. And another backline unit I'm currently not able to use here is Asuka. She's an 8-year-old girl who's wearing her grandfather as a cape, which is what gives her magic power. She's kind of technically the most powerful mage of Liazes, which doesn't mean much because Liazes isn't a very magical nation to begin with. And no, I'm not going to explain more about this. However, she is an 8-year-old girl. What do 8-year-old girls like? Well, some of them anyways. Colorful things? There's another character, Mill, who summons these things called phantom beasts, and they're colorful and round. So if you deploy both of them in battle together, you will actually get an event afterwards where Asuka, having seen these colorful phantom beasts of Mill, gets obsessed with them. She will then leave your army to hang out in Mill's room all day and play with the phantom beasts. In the long run, this will result in her learning a special skill and returning to the army. But yeah, this is Tata's brain. While we're talking about backline units and unforeseen consequences of things, I just happen to be at war with Szeth here, and having lost a lot of backline units here, here's another backline unit I can get. She's literally called Magic. She's the daughter of the king, and all I have to do to get her is defeat her in battle, which will make her retreat to a tower. Then she'll do a weird demon summoning thing, devil summoning thing. Very important to not confuse these terms in this context. And then that devil will come and he'll attack me in the enemy phase. I have to defeat him, and then I can go capture her tower, and then, well, I can get her. So yeah, let's go do that. Get us a new backline unit. I even brought her dad along, the King of Szeth. Don't ask why the King of Szeth is participating in the attack on Szeth. There's a reason for that, but that's too long to explain now. And yeah, you can say hi to her. Look at that. What a great dad. However, it turns out I made one little mistake here. There was one little flaw in my plan. You see, Magic can't really retreat to her tower if the battle in which I defeat her is the battle for her tower, and I just took the tower. So instead she just goes and dies. Yeah, things are complicated in this game. So, I think I've caused enough suffering here. How about we make someone happy? I feel Konami really deserves a break. She's probably one of my favorite characters in the series. She's a very hardworking ninja girl who's, well, really not fond of Rance, really not getting treated well by him. And, well, how about we get her fortune ending by having Rance treat her like shit? There's a couple of options we have for that, like making her get hamburgers and then getting mad at her, or, of course, just having Rance have a lot of sex with her. Not exactly of the consensual variety. And if we do that enough and send her on some missions in Zeth, she'll meet the Zeth Ninja Code, who, it turns out, will get a mission to assassinate Rance. Once we have all of this set up, we just end our turn and watch things unfold.